Well, hello and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the first of the Solus webinars that we're doing in the morning. We know that there's a few people that said evenings don't work for them, so we're going to try one in the morning. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be here for about an hour this morning. And the topic we've got this morning is about our Christian witness online. Now, obviously, we're never going to forget the spring and summer of 2020 when our whole lives moved online. I mean, for me, my social life has moved online. My work life has moved online, but I think strangest of all, Christian community and church has moved online. And the question really is this morning, are we making the very best of the opportunities that this unique situation gives us this spring? How can we make the very, very best of it? Now, joining us as ever this morning, we've got Gareth Black, who's zooming in with us across the Irish Sea, and Andy Bannister, who's joining us from Bonnie Dundee. Now, both of them are experienced Christian communicators, both in person, in print, and online, and their Christian communication has moved almost exclusively online over the last couple of months. And not only have they been thinking about how they do that best, but working with other people and observing what really, really works. And so they're going to give us some thoughts around those issues this morning. But of course, we'd love you to be involved in the conversation this morning as well. And as ever, we're going to use the pigeonhole system for that. So if you'd like to submit any questions, then we would love your questions, which will steer us through the second half of this hour this morning. Go across to pigeonhole.at. That website there is a great little tool for putting questions in. If you go to pigeonhole.at and type the code SOLAS for June, that will bring you through to the question and answer panel for this morning's webinar. And then we'll be able to see all your questions. Don't put them into the format that you're watching on. If you're on Facebook or Twitter, we won't see them. And more importantly, you won't be able to see each other's questions. So put your questions that will guide the second half of our conversation into pigeonhole.at and fire the code SOLAS for June into there. And any questions you have, put them in there and we'll work through them. Of course, if you see a question in there that you think is a really good question, you don't need to repeat it, vote for it, and then that will kind of move up the rankings. And I will put the questions to Andy and Gareth later on, and we'll really focus on those ones that have got the most votes. So vote for questions, put them up the list, put your own questions in there too. We will repeat that website address and code later on if you missed it now. But have a listen to some of the things that Andy and Gareth are going to start us off with, and then fire your questions in and be involved in the second half of our conversation. Going to start with you though, Andy. What do you think in this online context? What are the challenges and opportunities that the Christian community is facing at the moment?
Well, hello everyone, and thanks for that question. Thanks for that question, Gavin. I think let me address it two ways. I think there's a challenge and an opportunity. I think obviously the biggest challenge I think for us is, of course, so much of what we do as Christians and as churches when it comes to evangelism is designed around being together. Maybe our evangelism strategy has been hospitality with our neighbors, or maybe for a church, we've been running a Christianity Explorer Alpha course and people have been coming together in the church or a coffee shop. And of course, with lockdown and COVID-19, all of that is gone. And I think a lot of churches have scrambled to kind of figure out how to move stuff online. And I think a lot of Christians are just sort of still reeling, really thinking, well, what do I do when so much of what I was doing was incarnational and face-to-face? So I think that's the very obvious challenge. And as part of that, one of the responses is perhaps sometimes we've got too caught up in technology and we've perhaps busied ourselves far too much working out how to host a Zoom call than actually in terms of what we're actually engaging with. So that's the challenge. The opportunity, of course, as we've talked about on previous webinars, is I think there's a terrific spiritual openness right now. I think more people are asking spiritual questions than perhaps ever before. And more people are tuning into church and Christian activities than ever before. That's been reported a number of ways. Lots of churches are seeing great engagement. Certainly at SOLAS, we've seen great engagement on our online content. Other ministries have too. So I think there's a hunger. There's people wanting to connect. And of course, if you're a non-Christian wanting to check out the faith, it's easier in one sense to watch a live stream anonymously than perhaps creep in the back of a church and have people sort of bounce on you. So there's a tremendous opportunity in terms of reaching people, but also some challenges at the same time.
Good stuff. How are you over there in Ireland, Gareth? You doing okay?
I'm doing fine, thank you. It's a little more dull here today than it was on Friday night, but it's still good.
Very good. What I want to ask you then to kick off with is, In terms of the church's program moving online, obviously churches are wrestling with keeping their program going, their teaching going, their services going, looking after people practically, fellowship. Is evangelism, that sharing the gospel of Jesus with people that don't yet believe, is that slipping off the church's agenda? And if so, what can we do to make sure that that is kept kind of on the agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question, and certainly something that I think we'll explore through. None of us had any idea that it would affect us to the scale that it certainly has. And so because of that, we're forced and have been forced in many ways to react to this rather than to plan strategically. And there is a danger when we find ourselves doing that we sort of go as churches and as ministries into kind of low power mode and almost put all of our efforts into sort of reinforcing those ministry staples that we have, often like the Sunday service. And sometimes then that comes at the expense of evangelism. But I do think evangelism really does need to be our priority for two reasons. One, because there's loads of biblical precedent for it. I think of Paul writing to the Philippians in his own lockdown situation. Obviously, his freedom was taken out of his own hands, and he's responsible and accountable to government leaders for when that freedom comes back, if it does come back at all. But he writes to the Philippians and said, look, I want you to know that everything that's happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. So Paul was able to have the perspective that whatever circumstances he found himself in, even though his circumstances changed, his calling didn't. And there were opportunities there to share the gospel with people that under different circumstances he may never have met. So that's the biblical precedent. The second thing that I would say is, as Andy has mentioned, I think it's just an opportune time. I think there is a tide of interest that there maybe wasn't there before. People are not as distracted as they perhaps once were. A lot of the things that people find their security and their hope in have been shaken. And so it naturally raises questions for people. And of course, we all have this common experience that raises connecting points for conversation. We've all been through this and been affected by it in different ways. So we don't know just how long that window of opportunity is going to open, but there's certainly increasing evidence that there are huge evangelistic opportunities. And I think we'd be amiss to not take them as seriously as we possibly could.
Okay, so Gareth, staying with you, for an ordinary Sunday morning service, I know many people are saying that they're very aware that there are people outside the church who are tuning in, who, like Andy was saying earlier on, are maybe spiritually searching, or physically getting to a church building on a Sunday morning isn't possible, or they like to sneak in anonymously at the back, and they're tuning in to our regular Sunday mornings. What can we do to serve those people most effectively? How can we engage with them? What are the kind of things we need to do to help those folks?
Well, I'll mention a couple of things. The first thing I think is we really need to not just acknowledge that in theory or read about it in terms of statistics and polls like Tear Fund have done and things that have come out of the Church of England saying that people really are engaging. I mean, I'm not sure if our listeners are aware of the Tear Fund poll, but the poll that they did suggested that a quarter of adults in the UK were engaging with a church service over the period of lockdown, and 1/5 of those admitted to have never been to church before. So, I mean, that's hugely significant, and increasingly so. The biggest demographic of those tuning in were actually young adults aged 18 to 34. So there's increasing empirical evidence as well as anecdotal evidence that people are engaging, and I think we just need to keep that on the table when we're considering what we are sharing, what we are preaching, how we are communicating in these days. And of course, there's plenty of other things as well, but I'd say that as a start.
Okay. Andy, now in terms of focusing on the folks that aren't Christians and sort of being conscious about their needs, obviously when we talk about a Sunday morning service, the immediate things you think of are things like length of, screen and speaking to the screen and use of Christian jargon. Could you maybe draw in something for us about anticipating people's questions and anticipating the objections that our culture will throw up so that we can help people, because we know that our culture will generate huge numbers of objections to the biblical text that we'll be preaching. So could you help us with some of those ideas, please?
Yeah, thanks for that. And, one of my big influences across the years has been Tim Keller, probably kind of known to certainly many Christian leaders watching this and others. And I remember, reading an interview with him some while ago when he was kind of unpacking his method. And one thing he talks about that I think can be tremendously helpful for those watching who are pastors and preachers and teachers is to be always having in your mind that there are two types of people listening. I think firstly, Gavin, obviously, of course, there are Christians that, listening to an online sermon, all that kind of content. So, build them up, equip them, give them great sort of insight into the scriptures and so on and so forth, all those things. But also be aware that there may be people watching who are on various stages, actually, of exploring Christian faith. Maybe you've got outright skeptics watching who stumbled across your church video feed. Maybe you've got people who are seeking or searching. Maybe you've got people who haven't been to church in years and are really hanging on to Christian faith by their fingernails, and have all of those audiences in mind. And I think one way you can have some of our friends who are not yet Christians, who are skeptics or seekers or doubters or so forth, is, as you say, anticipate the objections. As you preach through a passage as a pastor, be thinking, okay, if I was not a Christian, what would be my question here? So a good example would be perhaps you're preaching through the Gospels, and you're talking about one of the many miracle stories of Jesus. Well, of course, to our non-Christian friends, miracles may seem quite improbable. We live in a culture that tells us that science can answer every question and the miraculous is not possible. So rather than just skate over that, why don't you find a way of weaving into the sermon something where you actually directly address the question, where you say, many of us have been raised in an age where we're told that miracles aren't possible. And here are some thoughts on that. And there are lots of great resources you can draw upon. Tim himself has got some wonderful books out there aimed at pastors, particularly in this. Or at Solas, you could go to our short answer video series on our website, where we tackle a lot of these. Either play one or just crib what we've done. We don't mind people using that material and address the question. And I think it's a great goal to have, that when someone who is not a Christian gets the end of your message that you've preached or shared on your church live stream, their questions have been addressed, or, as you say, even better, anticipated. If even before they've asked the question, as a pastor, you've said, well, maybe you might be asking yourself this question, and address it. And the other one final thought on that's really helpful in doing that, Gavin, is that then Christians watching learn, okay, that's how I'd address that question. And so when they perhaps talk about what they've heard in church on Sunday, and their friend, their neighbor, their colleague says, yeah, hang on, what about? It's really powerful if you can say, well, it's funny you asked that question. Actually, later in his message, my pastor actually addressed that, and here's what they said.
That's good. You also took us from the direction of churches towards individual Christians. Can I throw that kind of back towards you then, Gareth? Because there'll be several folks watching this that aren't responsible for a church online program, but I'm guessing everybody who's watching this is engaged with social media. They're on an online webinar. So what can Christian folks that maybe aren't responsible for a church online presence do to be effective in their kind of Christian witness online across the different platforms?
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. The first thing that I would say in response to that would be to try and be present on social media in a way that doesn't make it a massive gear change when you come to share something for the purposes of evangelism. I think we're all naturally evangelists when it comes to social media. And of course, social media is by definition a platform for broadcasting ourselves. And so we broadcast about our runs, we broadcast about our food, we broadcast about our children, our music, our pets, our holidays, and we never consider it to be evangelism, but that's exactly what it is. We're going public about things that deeply matter to us and that we consider good news. And for some reason, when it comes to Christian evangelism, we naturally then assume that it's a massive paradigm shift. And I don't think that it necessarily is. So I think we need to be on social media in a way that, yes, we're evangelistic, we're taking those opportunities, we're sharing good material, but in a much more holistic way, that is part of a wider experience and presence on social media where we're engaging positively. We're liking things that other people put up, provided we actually do like it, that we're engaging with stuff that maybe we don't find necessarily interesting in and of themselves, but but the people that we're trying to connect with and the people that we're friends with do find interesting. So there's all kinds of opportunities for that. Share about sport, share stuff that's funny, engage in community initiatives and various groups, and be a positive force. And I think that will give us credit then for sharing things that are more overtly evangelistic. We got to remember that people are our friends on Facebook and on these social media platforms for all kinds of different reasons. And perhaps if you invite a friend or a colleague to a carol service or an Alpha or a Christianity Explored, there's a sense of expectation that they have about what they're going to encounter. People don't have that same expectation on social media. And so if we purely saturate our social media page with evangelistic content, maybe controversial stuff, maybe political stuff with a Christian swing, it's likely that we'll be defriended or muted in some way. And of course, we don't want that. We don't want to cut people's ears off to the gospel. So the first thing that I say is lay the groundwork where you're a good presence online, and therefore your thoughts and your perspectives when it comes to Christianity are maybe not as overt, maybe not sort of directly sort of, you need to hear this, you need to read this, you don't believe this, here's all this evidence for Christianity, but maybe stuff like clips that appear on YouTube, maybe stuff about somebody's experience. I'm thinking of Simon Thomas, who's a Christian and who lost his wife, and obviously he's a Sky Sports News presenter. There's clips of people in the courtroom there's a clip that went viral very recently of a guy in America whose brother was killed by a lady, and he shared about how he forgave her and how she should give her life to Christ. You know, people find that stuff very inspirational, and it's just a non-controversial, inspirational way to just raise questions for people rather than just make hard, overt evangelistic propositions.
Yeah. That's really helpful. Thank you. Just a reminder that you can put any questions into Andy and Gareth by going across to pigeonhole.at and firing in a code, and the code is SOLAS for June. And I see that there's a few questions coming in already. There's a couple of good questions in there for you, so I will put those questions to you, Andy and Gareth, in a few minutes' time. But thank you for those of you who started off getting the question and answer going for the second half of the webinar. You can still chuck your questions in there or vote for questions that you think are the best ones in there. Okay, coming across to you then, Andy. If we're taking the Christian message out into the social media area, that's got a very particular culture, hasn't it? In fact, social media has really changed our culture in many ways. What do you think the implications are for communicating the Christian message for the kind of culture that we're going into today?
Well, Gavin, what can I say? What an amazing question. We could do a whole webinar.
It's a big question. I know.
That's a big question. Well, I think it's a very wise question as well. The reason being that I think digital technology, and particularly the internet, has changed our culture. I think we're all well aware of that. One of the reasons being actually that it's been noted throughout the history of technology that whenever communications technology changes, it changes society profoundly. So, you know, sort of 3,000 or more years ago, when writing was first invented, that changed culture tremendously. When we moved from papyrus to parchment and the codex in history, that changed everything. When the printing press was invented, that changed everything. The telegraph, radio, television, all changed the world tremendously. So communications, because we are naturally communicating creatures, and I believe as a Christian, because we're made in the image of God who's a communicator, gets the heart of who we are, and the internet's done that. And there's been some positive things and some negative things. The positive things is we can communicate more quickly than ever before. We can communicate more over great distance more easily than before. You think of the way that, say, video calling has changed the world. Now, you know, grandparents, in Australia can see their grandkids in Europe in a way they never could before. And it's brought all kinds of advantages. The disadvantages that it's brought, and I think this ties in particularly to the question you just asked there, is I think it's brought in distraction. As a real culture of distraction. As many people have said, you know, most of us are glued to our black mirrors, like, you know, these devices that they go around, they ping all the time. They're constantly with us. And even if you haven't got the thing actively on, you're still, as somebody said, digitally tethered. an interesting exercise for all of us is try going for a walk sometime and leaving your phone behind so that you are genuinely free and unreachable. It feels quite weird, actually, if you're not used to doing that, but it can be quite liberating. So we're distracted. And so for churches, the pastor's preaching a wonderful message and live streaming, and there's a very good chance that somebody's got 3 other windows open on their computer and their phone pinging and things. So we're dealing with a lot of digital noise and distraction we have to cut through. The other thing for Christians that we need to think very hard about, Gavin, is we also live in a culture, a digital media culture, particularly around social media, that can become narcissistic very, very quickly. As one journalist put it, Stephen Marsh, writing in the Atlantic magazine 8 years ago, actually, and things I think have got even worse since he penned these words. He said, curating the exhibition of the self has become a 24/7 occupation. For many people, and maybe this applies to some of you, watching this live stream, we can spend our days thinking about what are we tweeting, what's going on Instagram, how are we looking, how are we making sure that everyone knows that we're alive and busy and living wonderful lives. And suddenly, if we're not careful, we realize it becomes all about us. And for Christians, I think on social media, that's a challenge, because even if we're aware of this and we're careful of the temptations of pride and narcissism, at the same time, we want to, be promoting perhaps gospel stuff and the message of Jesus that we believe in. But the back of our mind should always be, where's the spotlight going? Somebody who does a lot of stuff on social media, I tell you, that's a constant struggle and a constant prayer. You log into Instagram and you get excited because 1,000 people have liked something you posted. And then I find myself asking, okay, do I need to be honest with myself, Andy? Am I excited because they've engaged with a really powerful C.S. Lewis quote about the gospel? Am I excited because, I've got 1,000 likes and 10 new followers? And that's a challenge. And I think just being aware of that is the first step. So yeah, distraction and busyness and digital noise, that narcissistic tendency, but at the same time, the incredible ability to reach and connect with people more easily. And we need to hold those two things together.
That's the difference between your social media profile and mine. You see, you get excited with 1,000 likes on Instagram. I get excited with about 10 to 15. So it's a different.
I bribe people. I just bribe people. I'm almost bankrupt.
One of the things I've been thinking about is the way that for years and years, particularly the tabloid press, have loved a scandal around a church. The vicar leaves his wife and runs off with the organist, and the media just love that kind of stuff. But in this kind of digital social media age, we're all in the media. And so we are all, I guess, under the temptation of discrediting the gospel publicly. What kind of ways do you think Christians can discredit the gospel and be a bad witness online? What are kind of some of the things that we need to sort of think about avoiding now that we are all in our self kind of propagating media spotlight?
Was that a question for me? Sorry, Gavin.
Yeah. Stay with you.
Yeah, no, that's a great, another really good question there. And there's a couple of things I'd say. I mean, firstly, you're absolutely right. We're, we can all be judge and jury. And I think I mentioned this on a webinar another night, actually, maybe the one last week, actually, where I said that, you look at the Dominic Cummings affair last week, and we don't need to go into the rights and wrongs of that. That whole battle, that whole argument played its way up publicly. But it was very interesting watching how quickly people could leap in and put the boot in. And, I observed a few Christians. I found myself thinking, look, even if you think that the guy was completely in the wrong, and that's a perfectly valid position, and I think there's good evidence for that, where does forgiveness come in? Where does realizing that, hey, I too have sinned in all kinds of ways. I've just been lucky the press haven't caught me. And I remember one friend who was like putting the boot in on that, and I remember saying to them, well, hang on, I thought just the other week you drove an hour and a half north to visit a family member yourself. To go, isn't that technically the same thing? So I think we need to be careful about not piling with the mob. Is the first thing. And Christian mobs exist. It happens. The other thing I think we need to think very, very hard about, Gavin, is there's something about sometimes in the Christian community, there's something about we love to be drawn to conspiracy theories. There's been work done on this, actually, showing that Christians are slightly more prone than the background population to sort of share conspiratorial stuff on social media. I think because we're used to being the outsider, there's something about a conspiracy theory that feels nice. It feels that, you know some secret truth that others don't. And of course, built into the gospel is that you have discovered this amazing, truth of who Jesus is. And obviously we're compelled to share that with others, but you still have that tendency then to go, oh, I like being part of sort of, bigger truths that others have not yet uncovered. And so I saw a really good example the other day that a friend sent to me of another friend where they'd screenshotted what their friend had done. And their friend's Facebook feed had literally, I think it was a conspiracy theory about 5G telephone masts and COVID-19, another conspiracy theory about sort of, Bill Gates and vaccines. And then underneath that was evidence for the resurrection. And my friend sent this to me saying, what do non-Christians think about this? Because you've got, sort of, crazy, and here's something that we believe passionately. And I think the answer is, if I was a non-Christian, I'd look at that and go, oh, okay, so what you're telling me is that the evidence for the resurrection is the same as evidence for these other conspiracy theories. Yeah. And that becomes a problem. And Augustine, that great, church father, 1700 years ago, I shall paraphrase, said words to the effect of, if your non-Christian friend hears you talking nonsense about something that he or she knows about, science or politics or whatever, why would they then trust you when you start talking about things that they don't know about, namely the gospel? Mm-hmm. And so we just need to be very careful. And there was something I think Gareth said earlier about, looking at our whole online presence. We don't need to be everything that we're doing is gospel this, Jesus the other, Bible quotes and so forth. We can behave just in a well-rounded way on social media. But just remember that people will look at your other social media stuff and judge the gospel stuff. This is just 1 Peter 3:16. The way that we engage the world, do it with gentleness and compassion and generosity and kindness, all the fruits of the Spirit from Galatians 5:2. And that sheds good light then upon the gospel stuff. Don't let your other social media stuff put people off the gospel.
Okay, so Gareth, I could bring you in on that then. Andy's thrown up some of the things which we kind of shouldn't do online, and so like mob behavior and sort of weird posts and that kind of stuff. What are some of the things that we should be doing online? How can we model a Christian alternative to some of the toxic online culture, and what could that look like?
Well, I think initially we need to think carefully about our tone. And again, not have this major separation between how we would conduct ourselves in a normal in-person conversation versus how we conduct ourselves online. I think that's one of the big problems with social media, that there's something about the fact that I'm not seeing you and we're not face-to-face in person that can really affect and distort what I say and also how I say it. And I think we need to remember that, we're called as Christians to live in such a way that is worthy of our calling in Christ and that represents Christ. We're ambassadors for Christ online and offline. We're to live in a way that's worthy online and offline. And so I think it's good to engage with some of these ideas. I think social media, as Andy has already touched about, it's in some ways inverted the natural process of how we engage. It used to be that in person we would engage with someone, we would see who they authentically are and how they authentically look like, and then we go to small talk, and then we eventually bore down to what they think and what they believe. Now it's the other way around. We actually we encounter people firstly through their ideas and through their values and through their worldview, and actually that can often be disconnected from the person. And one of the things that we may never see online is what a person authentically looks like and who they are in terms of their personality beyond those values. So I think we need to remember, as much as we do this in person, we also need to do it online, is that behind every question, behind every comment, behind every post on social media is a person with experience and a person with a history, and a person with a life that has precipitated those particular questions and perspectives. And we don't want to miss the person. We need to remember that Christianity is not just a set of ideas to intellectually assent to, it's a life. And as Andy has mentioned about the fruit of the Spirit, we've been given a spirit not of fear, but of power and love and of self-control. And sometimes the Holy Spirit needs to control ourselves and our own enthusiasm. So I think things like patience which is not in large quantities on social media and how we reply. The whole question Andy's raised about checking our facts, and then being careful about the political stuff as well. Let's remember that we need to represent the gospel, and it's easy to conflate that with certain political positions. And often we can cut people's ears off from hearing the gospel in its purest form, mere Christianity, because it's so packaged and confused with a lot of political and cultural references and nomenclature and things like that. And finally, then just ask questions more than make propositions. They're not confrontational. They invite a response. And if we can respond in a Christian tone and produce light rather than hate, and also just remember that apologetics is about defending the gospel. It's not about defending our wounded pride if somebody hits back at us, and it's not about getting defensive about the gospel. If we can bring all those things to play and just be, again, a good holistic presence on social media, I think then it will open a door and give us credit to share the gospel as appropriate.
Brilliant. So can we sort of land the end of this section then with a kind of some practical things? Gareth, can I stay with you and just ask you then, if you were in charge of your church's online presence, what would maybe be 2 or 3 practical things that you would do to make sure that the needs of those who aren't yet Christians are taken into account in what you do?
Yeah, I'm going to mention something that Andy's already touched on slightly, and that is, it's interesting to me that the internet was started by Tim Berners-Lee, I believe, in Geneva, which was also where Calvin began his preaching. And of course, the significance of that time when Calvin was preaching was Gutenberg had invented the printing press, and that was so effective it was a game changer for communication. And I think we need to see the internet in that light. Of course, there's a lot of vice, but there are huge opportunities. So let's take it seriously. This is a place where people reside, and we want to communicate where people actually reside and think and engage. And the second thing that I would say is put the evangelism factor on your table and keep it there. So if you're a ministry team and you're thinking through, the ministry schedule for the next 6 weeks or 2 months or whatever, put the evangelism factor on there and keep it there and keep factoring it into everything that you're doing, and then review what you've done in light of evangelistic factors. Okay. And the third thing, just finally then, what I would say is consult people who are more experienced than yourself. We understand that this is a difficult time for pastors and for leaders learning to speak to an unresponsive lens. Friday being the new Sunday for getting sermons and things like that ready. It's difficult, and it's hard then to sort of, and we can almost feel a bit guilty that we haven't factored in this evangelistic factor. But I think if that's the case and we're maybe struggling, then talk to people who are more experienced about it. Use resources and ask people for their help, and try and tell them a little bit more about your context. And of course, that's our bread and butter at Solus, and we'd love to help anyone that we can. Consultation is one of the things that we do, and we've also loads of resources that churches can use during this time.
Brilliant. And Andy, same question to you, but not for churches, but for individuals. If individual people want to represent the gospel of Christ better online, just a couple of practicals, where's a good place to start?
Yeah, thanks again for that. Just actually to pick up on something Gareth said, and then to answer your question, Gavin. Gavin, you and I were talking with, I forget which church leader the other day, gave us a really good example of something they were doing in their church. And I love sharing examples of good practice. And they were talking about the fact they'd gone through their week and were color coding everything they did. Do you remember this conversation?
Yeah, I do.
And so, what's going into the Sunday morning service and encouraging Christians, and what's evangelism? And they keep a very careful track on the colors. And that can be helpful because it can keep you focused. Otherwise, that Sunday morning service with all of the technologies, all the efforts that it makes to make a Zoom service look good, suddenly you discover that all of your energy is getting sucked into the church service.
Yeah.
But for individuals, I would say, let me just give three things. I'm a real Baptist in my background. Three things, just not all beginning with the same letter. The first is to begin being more proactive. If you're not already, on your social media feed, on your Facebook page or wherever, dripping in some Christian stuff, just begin doing that gently. And Gareth gave some good examples. When you see really inspirational things, just share them, not with a kind of gotcha, atheist kind of header, just to kind of, hey, I saw this story on BBC or wherever. Just really encourage me, and just drip that in and see what comments you get, and then engage with the comments. When friends like it or say something about it, engage. If people are hostile, don't get hostile back. Just say, oh, I'm sorry, you felt that way. Why did you? Or if someone says, oh, I like this too, why did you? Start conversations going, because conversations are the bread and butter of the gospel. Mm-hmm. Secondly, make use of the resources that we've put together at SOLAS. We love helping other people in this, and I think the evangelism tool that has really come into its own in the last few months under lockdown has, of course, I've mentioned this before, been our short answer kind of videos. These, I tell you, they are such a great evangelistic starter. We hadn't really thought about them being used this way, but we've had so many stories of people just literally sticking them up on their Facebook wall or tweeting them out. You don't need to write any commentary, just share them with somebody, and they all start conversations. And equally, if you're in a conversation with somebody and they ask a question you can't answer, there is probably a good chance we've covered it. And these are free, completely free. Please use them, distribute them. You don't need to ask us. And then the third thing I would say to put in there as well is similar to what Gareth said for church leaders, be looking for good kind of resources that you can use. One of the things I like, just because the way I'm wired and the background here gives you a clue, I love books. So I love in conversations with people online, finding ways to say, look, a really good book that I'd recommend on that is this. Or if I've read a really good book, I read a brilliant book last night by an Australian friend of mine on Jesus and Islam and engaging our Muslim friends. It's brilliant. So I thought, you know what? Just go to social media. It was 11 o'clock at night, took a photo, tweeted it out. And not merely have I blessed another Christian who's written it, lots of people are now sharing it and talking about it. So when you come across something good, share it with your friends. And again, and all of this, we are looking to start conversations and realizing that some of those conversations you might not be able to finish until after lockdown, but get them going now and use social media as a marketplace, as a place to have conversations and see how the Lord uses those.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Now, the question and answer board has lit up. I don't know what you said in the last couple of minutes, guys, but the questions have started to really pile in. So we need to get to those quite quickly now. But before we do, while I go across to Pigeonhole and have a look through the questions and get that organized, Andy, could you just tell us a little bit about SOLAS and who's organized this webinar, and maybe a few of the other things that SOLAS does in normal life and under lockdown? While you do that, I will get the Q&A ready and we'll go with everybody's questions in a minute.
Brilliant. Or two. Yeah, happy to. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Gavin. So for those of you who are new to us and what we do, so SOLAS, or the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, to give it its full title, we are a Christian organisation based in Scotland, but covering increasingly the whole of the country. Gareth is based in Belfast, and we specialise really in two things. One is evangelism, and particularly evangelism and sharing the message of Jesus in a way that engages people and takes their honest questions very seriously. So when we're not locked down, we do events in coffee shops and pubs and restaurants. We love partnering with churches to put on evangelism events to which it's easy to invite people. We're doing a lot of that online now. So if you go to our webinar page on the SOLAS Facebook, on the SOLAS website, you'll see that every other webinar we do is an open forum. And so last week we tackled the question of where is God in a coronavirus world. Next week we're looking at hope. And those are great to invite people to, so invite friends to. So we do a lot of evangelism, and we're really excited to see how God works through that, and stories of people coming to faith through having first been brought along to one of those events. Then secondly, we love teaching and training Christians how to share their faith more effectively at work, home, at school, at university. And again, when we're not in lockdown, we have our Confident Christianity conferences that we tour across the country. We're looking forward to a whole series of those planned for 2021. But in the meantime, we do, again, events like these webinars and other stuff on our website, mass amounts of content there to help churches and individual Christians share our faith in a way that's natural and engaging and persuasive. As we say, lots of online resources. We've mentioned a couple of times the short answer videos. We've had about 1.2 million watches and engagements on those over the last couple of years, and really, really helpful evangelistic tool. So keep a track on those. We have a new one coming out every couple of weeks. I'm predominant on them just because of the history of SOLAS. We're going to have Gareth all over them before too long. So do check those out. And would just really encourage you to stay in touch with us too. So the best way to find out all the new things that SOLAS is doing, the webinars, the free resources, all the other bits and pieces, if you go to our SOLAS webpage, solas-cpc.org, it's probably linked in whichever service you're watching this on, Facebook or Twitter or Insta thingamajig, and can't keep track up with them all. And if you go to our website, at the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little button that floats on every page, and you can click newsletter sign up and just pop your email in there. And we'll do two things. Firstly, we'll take your email and we'll sell it to Google, make lots of money. No, just joking, only joking. That's not what we don't do that. We look after your data very seriously. But what we will do is once a month rather, we will send you an email from us with news of all that we're doing, lots of resources and articles and events that you can tap into. And we get regular feedback from people that they love that email coming, because that's new stuff you can use in evangelism. But one last request, and this really is a heartfelt request. The only way that SOLAS can do what we do, we are a tiny organization. There are some Christian organizations that are massive, huge, with multi-million-dollar budgets, and that's not us. We're small and lightweight, and we like it that way because we can respond very nimbly to the needs. But it does also mean that we can only do what we do with help and support. And so if you've enjoyed this webinar, we don't charge for anything that we do, but we do trust, particularly for Christians, to prayerfully consider whether the Lord might put you on your hearts. If you go to the SOLAS webpage and go to solas.cpc.org/book offer, or you can click the donate button on our website, we got a really special offer right now. We encourage people to sign up to support us for £3 a month. That's roughly the price of a coffee or 1.5 coffees, depending on what brand of coffee you like drinking. And just £3 a month makes a massive difference. And to the work we do, we can do more of this kind of stuff, and particularly more of the evangelism that we love to do. And as a thank you, we have got, it's very exciting, we've got a limited number of these Healthy Faith and the Coronavirus Crisis books. It's a fantastic resource with chapters from a whole range of different Christian authors in there, including myself and many other names that many of you would recognize, covering almost every aspect of how, as Christians, we can live well and follow Jesus well under lockdown. I've written a chapter on evangelism, so if some of the stuff that I've shared in the last half an hour has interested you, there's a whole chapter in there, and it's an ebook, and we've got some copies from IVP that we can give away as gifts to people who sign up to get behind and help us. Prayerfully, would you consider that, friends? Because it does mean we can do more of these and continue making a difference, training Christians and reaching those with no faith yet in Jesus Christ. Gavin.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Right, Gareth, Andy, now it's your opportunity to respond by saying that's a really great question, and to answer some of the really great questions that have lit up Pigeonhole in the last sort of 10, 15 minutes. Okay, so Gareth, can I start with you then? And someone has asked, how can we translate the massive online engagement into offline engagement when we are coming out of lockdown? How can we do that transition?
Well, let me just mention two things. The first thing is to try and personalize it. So the thing with a lot of the online engagement is it's very broad, and it's reaching a lot of people, which is great, but there's not as much connection with individual stories where the conversation can go deeper. So my encouragement would be is if you see friends or colleagues or whoever on Facebook or on these social media platforms who are engaging and who are interested and who are maybe asking questions or liking things, then personalize it, go to that person directly online. And the second thing then is just make the invitation. We're getting to a point now where lockdown is beginning to ease. And we are able to connect with people, and we've been impoverished in terms of social engagement and face-to-face conversation for so long, and I think that's really opened up a renewed interest. People have more space for connecting with people, longer conversations. So simply personalize it, and then the second thing, actually make the invitation. You'd be so surprised at how many people would actually engage if they were invited, and so often we just assume that they wouldn't be interested or that we'd offend them in doing it. And of course, that all depends on how we make the invite. But many people do respond positively to an invitation.
Can I stay with you then, Gareth? Another question is basically asking, does the church need to stay online when lockup, ends and we can go back into physical buildings to keep some of the current sort of opportunities going?
Well, every church will need to sort of assess just how effective they're being online during this sense. So there's no cookie cutter approach, but I do think that if we get a sense, and I would be surprised if we didn't have any sense that we're engaging with new people, that people are picking up the content, I think we should make the most of that. That's not to say that we sort of abandon buildings and and don't give up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing. I don't think we should do that, but I don't think we should see it as an either or. Obviously, lockdown has forced us into a particular way of doing things. We're not saying that that's necessarily better. What we are saying is the change of circumstances don't change our call and their opportunities. So let's make the most of those. And if we have the capacity and we see the advantage, then even when we're back together, let's continue our online presence just as appropriately as we can. And if we do pick up individuals along the way and begin to engage, and maybe they're not quite at that point yet where when we're allowed to be back together, they're not ready to be in that place, I would say just have people who are willing to keep that conversation going online and to pick up those people, and let's aim for seeing those people come right through to the point where they're with us, they're confessing Christ, they're being baptized, and they're fully integrated into our local churches.
Okay, Andy, can I bring you in now? Next question that's kind of worked its way up towards the top of the chart here is, it's got a lot of votes here, and someone's really asking about the validity of online evangelism. Can I read the question to you? Because it's been a popular question. It's quite carefully phrased. Didn't Jesus and Paul too model evangelism and discipleship through community and relationships rather than just passing on information? Is it really evangelism we're doing online or just publishing? Andy.
Wow.
It's a mouthful, but...
Yeah, well, the interesting thing, let me start with the just publishing piece. Definitely, I was going to say this can tap into a couple of things. If we're not careful, I completely agree. This can tap into the whole narcissism piece. That actually we think it's evangelism, but it's really about, hey, how many numbers can we get on our church live stream? And isn't it really exciting? So we need to be wary of that. The other thing we need to be wary of, and I think that lies behind the question, is if we're not careful, we can, particularly as evangelicals, Christians, we are tempted towards the idea that, being a Christian is just about head knowledge. It's all about having the right theology, having the right ideas. And of course, if that's what you think the gospel is and Christianity is, then it's very easy. Live stream is fantastic. Here's the information. All I have to do is download it to you, whether you're a Christian in the pew or someone I'm evangelizing, and the job is done. And for those of us who love apologetics, sometimes even offline, we could behave like that. Hey, you haven't got a faith in Christ. Let me download my arguments to you. And we miss that relational part. I completely agree. There's look how Jesus used hospitality, as a big evangelism tool. Look how Paul, whenever he could, he tried to be with people right there in their midst, spending, several years there in Ephesus, debating and dialoguing with people so that people got to know him. So yes, there is that danger. I would just say a couple of things. I think whilst we can be cognizant of that danger and aware of it, particularly when we're out of lockdown and we don't just get sucked into just carrying on the way that we're doing now, I also think there is a model in the New Testament of everybody involved in the propagation of the Christian faith in the early years, seizing every opportunity they could. So I think Gareth may already have mentioned this one. Think of Paul, where he's there in prison. He doesn't go, well, I can't do evangelism because I'm locked up and chained to 2 Roman soldiers, and therefore I can't do it. He does 2 things. A, he takes the personal opportunity. He starts evangelizing to the soldiers he's chained to. You can't get more present than, they can't get away from me because I'm chained to them. But he also writes letters. He writes and he writes and he writes. He takes every opportunity to use the technology of his day, which was letters. And as many scholars have pointed out, the other thing that Paul utilized to the full was the Roman road network. That was an amazing technological innovation of his day, that it was possible to send messages from one end of the empire to the other very quickly. So I think for us, I'd recognize the force of the question and say, how right now, given it's the best we have, how do we use it? Realizing but it has some weaknesses and some limitations. And particularly as we come out of lockdown, for people that we've been engaging with online, how do we now begin moving it into the more relational? If you've been talking with somebody online, what a great opportunity now for those of us who are allowed to do this, to say, hey, why don't you meet for coffee? Why don't we get together and go for a walk in the woods? And it was great. We unlocked here in Scotland a few days ago, began to, and so we went for a walk with our next door neighbours last night, who don't have a Christian faith, as far as I know, kind of right now. And that was a great sort of dipping our feet back into being more relational and connected rather than remote. So yeah, the internet is a tool and it is very helpful, and we've got some precedents in the New Testament, but let's completely recognize that evangelism needs to engage the mind, engage the heart, and also demonstrate, I think, in practical compassion and friendship, what the gospel looks like.
Interesting, you picked up on that narcissism. Somebody called David quipped further down in the pigeonhole box saying, hasn't bums on pews become likes and views? Isn't narcissism alive and well in the church? Thank you for that one, David. I was quite amused with it, but I think we've sort of got into some of that territory around narcissism. That's quite nicely put. Okay, Gareth, can I ask you to have a response to this next one that's working its way up the list here? Should we respond to memes, etc., shared by others that are sarcastic, or I guess aggressive towards Christianity, given that these may not really be an invitation to dialogue? Gareth.
Yeah, that is a great question, and it kind of relates to this whole question of what if we do share stuff online and we get quite negative or antagonistic feedback. A couple of things that I think I would say about that is, first, I think we need to expect it. Jesus said that we would be ostracized and we would be thrown out of certain places, or perhaps that looks like unfriended now, because of our commitment to Christ. And so we need to just expect that there will be potentially some response, and sometimes some hostile response, and as gentle and respectful and wise as serpents, as gentle as doves as we try to be, there will always be that. And so we just need to have that expectation. But I would say in that we need to try as much as possible to make sure that the things that people do disagree with or that they have a problem with is the gospel itself, the content of the gospel itself, rather than necessarily the tone with which we've presented it. So again, it's trying to separate, the mere Christianity from some of the other ways we might package it. I think memes can be very effective. They're just simple. Many of them are just simple truisms. Some of them are funny. I think that can be a good way of sharing simple things. But I think we also need to remember, again, not to necessarily fight back, and remember our tone, and remember that Christian apologetics is as much about being Christian as it is about being apologetic. And so we need to bring those things in and just be careful. And again, establish as much as possible whether a person's objections are genuine or whether they're just spoiling for an online battle royal. And I don't think we necessarily have any responsibility before God to engage with people when their motives are purely to discredit us and mock us, and they're not actually interested in truth. Jesus was very good at that. He was very able to establish motives of the Pharisees and things like that, and engaged in them on that basis, and often didn't engage when he was aware that they weren't interested in truth. They were simply interested in discrediting him. So one final thing that I would say is, if this person is prepared to engage, and we're not discouraged early on, that's another thing. Don't completely be discouraged, but do try to tease out where it's coming from and what's behind it. Then try to get the conversation offline and away from a public forum as quickly as possible, so that you're engaging with the person, and so that everybody else in that public forum is not seeing this, ideological jousting that's going on. I think engage with the person as much as possible.
Excellent. That's helpful, Gareth. You might be amused to know, Gareth, that someone fired in, not a question, but Gareth, I love your bookshelf, which has also received several votes while you were speaking there. So congratulations on your bookshelf. That's great. But more seriously, thank you for that. That's a really helpful way into that question. And there's a couple of questions that I want to kind of combine together and put to you as one question, because I know you've been doing a lot of reading, a lot of work recently on social media and how to market things. A couple of churches are asking how they can make their online presence more visible. So one person is saying, which platforms should we use to go online? Another person is saying, how can we make our YouTube of our Sunday morning service more visible? And I think they're particularly talking about how they can become more visible to people outside their immediate church community. And I know you've been reading about that recently. So can you give us a steer, a few practical tips on that, please?
Yeah, for sure. So the first thing I think I would say is realize that the different social media platforms have different kind of pros and cons. So Twitter tends to be kind of very kind of noisy and angry and sort of a bit like a bullfight. I often think actually whenever I read about Paul in Ephesus, you know, renting the lecture hall of Tyrannus and debating every day, I think that's Twitter. So that might not be the best place you want to focus your energy. Instagram is really kind of good for sort of, you know, kind of visual stuff. If you've got people in your church who are visually wired and the ability to sort of be kind of graphical and snazzy in what they do, that's worth thinking about. I think the best platforms for churches, though, to use for communicating for most churches are going to be YouTube and are going to be Facebook. And of the two of them, if you're a church with a limited resource and limited expertise, I'd start with Facebook. The reason I would say I would start with Facebook is you can do an awful lot with it for almost no money. It's possible to create a relatively nice church Facebook page. You can invite and encourage church members and people who come to your church to like that page and then be following it and sharing the content with friends. Which brings me to my second point. The best way to be promoting what your church does online and drawing people in is the same way we would actually offline, which is encouraging and making it easy for people who attend the church to get their friends engaged. And so even if it's a very simple church Facebook page, make sure the content is fresh, make sure there's something there for Christians as well as for non-Christians. That point I made about sermons earlier, you know, think to yourself, okay, how would everything on my church Facebook page, how would someone who's not a Christian and not part of my church community, how would they view that? Make it winsome, make it friendly, you know, avoid being sort of negative or sort of tribal. And that way you'll encourage Christians as part of your community start inviting their friends, because that's far more effective than thinking about, oh gosh, how can we go out and start, you know, trying to engage in, you know, spending money promoting what we're doing. So use the networks that you already have. And then thirdly, another really great way of engaging and bringing more people in is look for, you know, other churches and other Christians who are doing things like you are doing and get plugged into those networks. So Facebook has Facebook groups. And it's worth finding, you know, find if your church is part of a denomination, you know, find, is there a Facebook group for, you know, for Baptist churches or Anglican churches or free churches, you know, get plugged into that, because that will give you, you know, insight into what other Christians are doing. It will increase your reach, and together we're stronger and have a bigger impact. And it builds Christian community and Christian unity. And there's a very powerful, I think, evangelism aspect to people looking in, seeing that Christians are not online competing for views. We're not out there trying to beat the church down the road, but we're helping one another. We're working together. Which brings me to my last point. Look for ways you can collaborate with other churches. You know, maybe you haven't got the resources to do a really good church live stream, but maybe there are two other churches in your community who are the same size as you and your friends and have worked together in the past. What about collaborating? What about saying, why don't together we come together and put on a really good Sunday morning church live stream? Take it in turns for the pastors from the different churches to preach. You know, get laity involved who know what they're doing to help you do that really, really well. I sometimes look at some church live streams and I think, gosh, that looks a little bit, you know, not as tight as it could be. And then you look and see two churches down the road are equally doing stuff for where they're struggling. And I think, gosh, if they just work together, you could produce something much, much bigger. This is a real time for church unity and standing together and encouraging one another. So I hope some of those ideas help.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. So Gareth, we're kind of running towards the end of our time slot, but I think we've got time for another couple if we kind of keep it moving. Someone's commented here saying, are we too focused on online church? What about people that aren't online? What about the elderly or the poor at the margins? What's your response to that, Gareth?
My immediate response would be to say we can be, and certainly proportionally we have been during this time, but I don't think it's necessarily an issue of principle, simply an issue of what the situation that we find ourselves. And necessity of circumstance. So again, I think social media and being online is a great servant, but it's a terrible master. So let's use it as much as we can, but not pick up the idea that it's somehow mutually exclusive from everything else. There are plenty of people who aren't on social media. There are plenty of people, as the questioner has asked, that have other needs. And I think it's not a case of either or. And one of the things that I'm really grateful for in my own church is, as much as we have an online presence and we're blessed with a great media team and we're able to put a lot of good online content out, we've also created teams where we can serve those who can't get online and resource them, both in terms of Christian content and evangelistic content, but also in terms of those practical needs. So again, it's this whole sense of a holistic Christian approach to where we find ourselves. It's not an either or, it's both and.
Yeah. Absolutely. Andy, last thing here, and then we're kind of going to be pretty much out of time. Someone has asked, do Christian memes have any place in our online Christian presence? Andy?
Christian memes. Oh dear. Let me say both a yes and a no. I think we talked earlier about skeptical memes. Let's not just reverse that on the other side. There are some one or two kind of snarky Christian memes I've seen doing the rounds. And I think we should avoid those. In fact, somebody said a really good grid you can go through before you post anything online is to ask yourself the question, like, is it true? Is it helpful? Does it magnify the gospel? Does it, if the answer to any of those is no, then don't do it as you work down that on that grid. Where Christian memes can be helpful, and actually you'll see if folks go to the SOLAS Facebook page or my Instagram, for example, you'll see I play around with things a little bit. One thing I found quite helpful is taking a really good quote. So today I put a C.S. Lewis kind of quote up on the SOLAS Facebook page. It's thought-provoking. It's not snarky. I hope people would look at it and go, oh, that's interesting. And it took me, I confess, all of 2 minutes to throw together. I am not a graphic designer. I was just able to find a picture that went behind it, stick the quote on there, stick it up. And I find that's really interesting, because I'll get engagement there. Sometimes I'll get people say, oh, that's interesting, or people might disagree, and then you're off, like we've talked about. You can say, well, that's interesting. Why do you disagree? So I think there can be a place for them, but in all of it, they asking the question, am I doing this because I want to get traffic? And as somebody, as that comedian on our Pigeonhole said, have we just replaced pews for likes? Ask yourself that. Or am I posting this because I think that there is a chance, by God's grace, that this might draw some people to think about Christian faith, and also for Christians to be edified, and to be asking yourself the question, does this glorify Jesus and lift him up? Or is it about making me look clever and sophisticated and edgy and whatever? And if it's the latter, maybe just think twice. There's a lot of digital noise out there. We don't need to contribute to it. But I do think God can work through memes, because God has created all art forms. And I think it's exciting when Christians embrace the arts. And there are some brilliant Christian communicators out there doing this stuff really, really well. And if the Lord has wired you that way, do it. Or if you've seen something and you pray about it, you think that's great, that does the job perfectly, share it and pass other people's stuff on.
Yep, that's great. And it also covers one of the questions we didn't get to, which was about, should churches try and create all their new content or just sort of signpost online to good stuff that's already out there? But I think we kind of bounced through that question talking about, local partnerships and pointing to what's good and all those things. So sorry we didn't get a chance to address that question in full. That would have been a good question to move into. Thank you for everybody that has sent in questions, really thought-provoking Q&A, some really good stuff in there. We really do appreciate it when you don't just sit back and listen, but get into the Q&A and steer it through with us. It adds so much to doing something like this when we know that the flow of the conversation has got you involved as well. We really enjoy that a huge amount. Well, we are through our hour. Our time has sadly gone. It went very quickly. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much to Gareth for your contributions, and Andy too. The other question that somebody put into Pigeonhole was, how can we find out more about SOLAS and what you do and how we can help churches like yours? But we didn't know your name and we don't know what church you are. So if that was you, could you bounce across to our webpage, which is www.untitled www.solas, solas-cpc.org. And in there, you'll find an About section, which tells you loads about all the different things we do. But there's also a contact or connect button. If you press on that, send us an email and we'll be able to chat to you in detail about what your church is like and how we might be able to plug in and serve you. And we are really looking forward to when we can unlock and get back out and see people face to face and work with churches. If you'd like the newsletter that's coming up on the screen there, please have a look at that, and then you'll get a monthly update telling you about some of the things we're up to and also how you can work with us and pray for us too. We would really, really appreciate that. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Gareth. Thanks for joining us. And we'll see you again in, I think it's 10 days time, isn't it, Andy, for the next one?
10 days to the next one. It's all the information there on the SOLAS website.
If you do solas-cpc.org/webinars, then all the future ones of these webinars will be up there for you. So thanks again for joining us and goodbye. See ya.
Have a great day, everybody.